Okay, let's get started. We're going to talk about the Swiss Anabaptists this morning. Swiss Anabaptists. Okay. Roman numeral 1. Again, I'll need to explain this. This is what I want you to write down as a reminder to you. The Bible study group in Zurich. The Bible study group in Zurich. Zurich is a Swiss city. This is taking place at roughly the same time that Luther is going through all his time of coming to grips with the gospel and so forth that starts the Reformation proper. At the same time, in Zurich, there's a group of young men who are meeting together to study the Greek New Testament together. Now, that holds significance to us for a couple reasons. Many of the men who were part of that group become the leaders of the Swiss Anabaptists in a short few years after that. However, one of the men who meets in that group is a fellow named Ulrich Zwingli. Ulrich Zwingli. Even though he's not as famous as Luther, he's as much a founder of the Reformation as Luther is. He comes out and challenges the Roman Catholic Church in Switzerland and becomes the leader of the Swiss who want to break with the Roman Catholic Church. However, this Bible study group we're talking about is before you get to the time of Zwingli having that kind of leadership and so forth. What's interesting about this is that as these young men studied the Greek New Testament together, most of them came to the conclusion that it was clear that the Greek New Testament taught nothing about infant baptism, taught nothing about any kind of baptism other than believers' baptism. As a group, they begin to move in the direction of Baptist principles and become the Swiss Anabaptists. However, when you get to the subject of infant baptism, even though for a while Zwingli seemed to agree with the folks around him, when you get to the subject of infant baptism, eventually Zwingli comes to the position that they have to maintain infant baptism, and he breaks with the rest of them and no longer becomes a part of that study group. Now that is going to be important to us very shortly as we begin to look at this. Zwingli understands the Anabaptists, he understands what they're teaching, he was with them in the early days, but he doesn't continue to go that direction. That's going to be important to us because as he becomes the influential leader of the major non-Catholic party in Switzerland, we're going to see him in real conflict with our Anabaptist fathers. Now, just this very week while I was in Canada, I had a chance to pick up a book that's out of print that I once had and had read, 15 years ago or so, that I knew dealt a lot with Zwingli and the Swiss Anabaptists and so forth. And I loaned it to somebody or whatever, and I just lost track of it some time back. I didn't have that book when I first prepared material to teach Baptist history, but I did come across it a few days ago and had a chance to reread at least that part of it. And the author pointed out this is really where Zwingli's coming from. This is more a political conclusion on his part than a one that comes from studying the Greek New Testament. Here's what I mean by that. Zwingli knew that if they were going to break the power of Roman Catholicism, they had to have an army, they had to have a strong government that would rival the Catholic government, and a strong army. Okay? He particularly had studied Arnold of Brescia. Remember what happens when Arnold puts together somewhat of a local collection of militia and runs the Pope out and declares Rome free? What ends up happening? Yeah, within a couple of years, a major army comes in, Rome is taken back, Arnold is killed. Zwingli has studied that. Zwingli says, no, we've got to have a government and a state that's powerful enough to challenge Roman Catholicism. And in his mind, I'm not defending him. We're going to read about what he does here, and it's horrible, but I'm trying to explain the mindset, and I am trying to explain he had to face different pressures and challenges than you and I do. His conclusion was that only a rival state church government could be powerful enough to challenge Catholicism. And one of the concepts behind infant baptism was that it made you a citizen of the state church. So Zwingli wants to teach salvation by faith. He no longer wants to baptize babies and say it's part of their salvation. But he doesn't want to give up baby baptism because he wants a strong enough government to be able to actually go head-to-head with Roman Catholicism and win. This is not an idle concern, by the way. After Zwingli becomes the head of Switzerland, every spring when the snows melt, he has to fight Roman Catholic armies. He actually dies on the battlefield fighting Roman Catholic armies. I mean, this is a real problem. This is not an imaginary problem on his part. But nonetheless, it's his trying to come up with man's solution rather than looking to God for his solution. So this is what was in Zwingli's mind. We've got to have a stronger government than that. If we start letting everybody decide about baptism for themselves, we'll be fractured, we'll go different directions, we won't be strong enough to stand up to the Roman Catholic armies. Now, I'm not defending that, like I said, but I will say I understand the temptation, never right to go against Bible doctrine no matter what you're facing. But you do at least have to admit Zwingli was tempted with problems and challenges that you and I don't have. Okay? That was Roman numeral 1. Roman numeral 2. After Zwingli became the national leader in Switzerland, he tried to enforce the laws requiring infant baptism. After he became the national leader in Switzerland, he tried to enforce the laws involving infant baptism. And this leads him into direct conflict with his former Bible study partners, and we're going to trace this conflict. You force infant baptism. They're going to require it. It's the law. It was already the law under Roman Catholicism. Now they're going to continue it as the law, but instead of getting baptized in the Roman Catholic Church, have your babies baptized in Roman Catholic, you're going to have your babies baptized in the state church. Okay? This is going to lead to a number of conflicts. Underneath this, the men who would later be known as the Swiss Anabaptists held a meeting in the home of Felix Manz. The men who would later be known as the Swiss Anabaptists held a meeting in the home of Felix Manz. Now, I want you to understand, even though they've been studying this for years, they haven't done anything about it. The conclusion they came to is that their baptism as babies into the Roman Catholic Church wasn't worth anything. Well, now they come together and they make a public commitment to stand for believers' baptism. And make sure you get that down. They make a public commitment to stand for believers' baptism. Felix Manz becomes one of these important men. I'm going to list a couple more here that will come up more than once. Conrad Grebel and George Blaurock. One of the problems these folks faced, now that you've come to conclusion that your baby baptism isn't worth anything, what do you do? Okay? These particular folks had not had contact with, none of them had been baptized by immersion, even though there were preachers around that taught that, none of these men were in contact with them. So what they did, Conrad Grebel baptizes Blaurock, and then Blaurock baptizes Grebel and the rest of them. People still debate, and they say, well, under what authority could Grebel baptize, since he had not even himself been baptized? And that may be a point that folks fuss about today. Let me tell you, we can sit back real easily and fuss about that today, because anybody wants to get baptized as they should today can find a whole bunch of independent Baptist churches around to baptize them. These gentlemen were in a different ball game. They saw clearly what the Scripture said, and if you're going to get baptized by immersion, somebody's got to put you under the water. And if you don't have somebody there that's already been baptized himself, somebody's got to go first. So Grebel baptized Blaurock, and then Blaurock baptizes the rest of them. Made a public commitment to baptism by immersion of believers only. So now you have these men taking this step, and this, of course, immediately puts them at odds with Zwingli and the state church. These folks weren't the first people to teach believers baptism there. There had been Waldenses around. There had been Henricians around. There had been Petrobrusians around. But these men had not had a chance to be baptized by any of these folks that already taught this. And the other thing that I think really becomes significant about them, these were people who had been in positions to some degree of influence and leadership, and when they took this step, everybody notices it. It becomes very public, it becomes possible for Zwingli not to notice it. In fact, Zwingli knew all these people. And so it becomes a very public issue. B, these men begin to be called the Anabaptists. They begin to be called the Anabaptists by their enemies. That's not what they called themselves. They called themselves the Swiss Brethren. But they begin to be called Anabaptists by their enemies. As we said before, the name by which we remember these principles today, Baptist, comes out of their answer to that. Anabaptist means rebaptizer, or baptizing a person for a second time. And their answer to being called Anabaptist is, we're not Anabaptists. We don't baptize anybody for a second time, because that baptism that took place when you were a baby, that putting of water on you when you were a baby, in baptism. Okay? Anybody ever joke in a swimming pool and dunk somebody? That's not baptism. You may have got wet, but it doesn't make a baptism. We used to, when I was a kid, we used to play a lot of water polo at camp in the summer. And we didn't really play by all the water polo rules, but they'd let you get the volleyball or whatever we were using and hang on to it, and somebody'd be trying to go to where you could score, and they'd always yell the same thing. Somebody baptize him. So I meant dunk him until he lets the ball go. Okay? And so you would get dunked until you were willing to let go of the ball. It got pretty rough sometimes. Well, we might have used the word baptism, but that didn't make it baptism. Okay? Most of us were already baptized, but if somebody got in there that hadn't been baptized and we put them under the water till they let go of that volleyball, that wasn't baptism, no matter what we called it. So that was their answer. Not Anabaptist, Baptist. So we don't rebaptize them, we baptize them for real. See? Felix Montz, Conrad Grabel began to go door to door in Zurich, telling people about salvation and believers' baptism. They begin to go door to door in Zurich, telling people about salvation and believers' baptism. Sound familiar to any of you? By the way, it's pretty obvious at this point they're not trying to hide from the state church, is it? You don't hide from the state church by going door to door. And it's also obvious they don't recognize the authority of the state church to tell them what to believe or what to do in terms of their faith, isn't it? That sounds like what? Separation of church and state. These are people who, from their own writings, you can clearly tell they believe all the things today that we call the Baptist distinctives. Okay? Hundreds of people get saved. Other people get involved in going door to door. Hundreds of people get saved and begin to accept believers' baptism. Okay? This really gets people's attention when a Roman Catholic priest gets saved and accepts believers' baptism. Well, again, Zwingli's afraid this is going to affect his ability to have a strong government and sponsor a strong army. So, D, the Swiss government arrested all of the Anabaptist leaders and sentenced them to life imprisonment. They arrested all of the Anabaptist leaders and sentenced them to life imprisonment. They arrested all the Anabaptist leaders, Mance, Grabel, Blaurock, and the other men associated with them. They arrested them, they sentenced them to life imprisonment, and passed a law requiring capital punishment for any future believer's baptism. Capital punishment for any future believer's baptism. Matter of fact, the prescribed punishment is death by drowning. One of their leaders is quoted as saying, they wish to be immersed so much, let us immerse them. And they would literally put a ball and chain on you and throw you in the river. That was the law. E, in 1526, 14 Anabaptist leaders escaped from prison. 1526, 14 Anabaptist leaders escaped from prison, including Grabel, including Blaurock, including Mance, 11 others. 1526. They escaped from prison and began to go throughout Switzerland, Austria, and Germany preaching. They began to go throughout Switzerland, Austria, and Germany preaching. As you can imagine, they couldn't stay and preach in one place for very long. They'd go preach the truth. They'd preach to assemblies that met in secret. They'd preach out in public in the villages, but they had to move quickly because the authorities were on their trail. Well, during the course of this, constantly having to move, constantly having to sleep outdoors, constantly having to hide, Grable developed pneumonia and died out in a field hiding. Actually, if I'm not mistaken, he was hiding in bushes, and the pneumonia overwhelmed him to the place where he couldn't walk, and he just laid there with the shakes that you get when you get pneumonia and died from it. Well, Mance and Blaurock are recaptured, but Blaurock escapes again. Mance is taken to is tied to a long pole and told to recant his belief in believer's baptism. When he refuses, they place him under the water, hold him there for a while, then bring him back up. They ask him again to recant. He doesn't. They put him under, hold him a little longer this time, bring him back up. Again, they ask him to recant. They bring his mother there and force his mother to watch this process. And while they're doing this to him, his mother cries out, "Felix, do not recant. Do not recant." And eventually they hold him under long enough that he drowns and goes to heaven. Probably ought to mention that part, huh? F. Blaurock continues for several years to go through Switzerland and Germany preaching. Then when an Anabaptist preacher, Michael Kirshner, folks, the Reformed authorities come and take this Anabaptist preacher out of his church and they burn him at the stake. So Blaurock comes to the church and accepts the pastorate. By the way, can there be any doubt, not only in your mind when you're told this, or any doubt, I think there could have been any doubt in his mind what was going to happen to him when he came and took the pastorate of this church? They start having open, what we'd call today, revival meetings, and the Reformed authorities come and take Blaurock and the evangelist, torture them publicly, and burn them at the stake. I have a question for you preacher boys. Would you take a pastorate if you believed God was calling you to it? If you knew it meant that in very short order you'd get burned at the stake like the last pastor? These folks did. By the way, I want you to catch this because this is important. We're reading about these people being chased and harassed and drowned and burnt. It's not the Roman Empire or the Roman Catholic Church now that's doing it. It's the Protestants in Switzerland. Roman numeral 3. Well, these leaders are gone now, but that's not the end of the story. Roman numeral 3, the Swiss Anabaptists spread. An A underneath this. It's a fellow named Balthasar Hubmaier. Interesting man. Balthasar Hubmaier. He is a Roman Catholic doctor of theology who gets saved under Anabaptist preaching. And so he begins to preach all the Baptist distinctives. He's a Roman Catholic doctor of theology, gets saved under Anabaptist preaching, and he begins to preach all the Baptist distinctives. And so they arrest him and order him to recant or they'll kill him, and he recants. And so they let him go. He goes back to preaching Anabaptist or Baptist distinctives. And then they arrest him and order him to recant or they'll kill him. And he recants publicly and then goes back to preaching the Baptist distinctives. Some folks have criticized him for that. Other folks just think he'd figured out how to handle those folks. Whatever, the third time he gets faced with recanting or death, he refuses to recant, and he's killed.
Had his fingers crossed.
You think maybe? I've read things, real critical of him and so forth, and I think maybe there was a time when his name was associated with cowardice for the faith. I don't know if this was a calculated plan on his part or just when faced with that moment twice he made a mistake. Only thing I can say is all the folks that are writing critical of him have never been in the same position. And I know what the end of his story was. So I'm willing to give him credit for the thing, yeah.
How do you feel about someone who says that now and actually continue preaching the gospel of the right thing?
I don't know. I don't know. I'm not convinced that's God's way. That is not, and that comes up, by the way. I mean, this really does come up, and it begins to come up quickly. Even some of the Waldenses did this in areas that weren't as heavily populated with Waldenses. They'd go to the Catholic church on Sunday morning so that they wouldn't be in trouble, and then they would have their services on Sunday afternoon. Or they'd go sprinkle their children when their children were born, even though they knew it wasn't baptism, because they didn't want their children taken away from them. And then, but then they'd teach their children as they grew up that was never really baptism. It's a very hard thing for folks when they're faced with love for family and so forth, to conceive, not just of the authorities taking them, but for the authorities taking his wife, taking his children. And that debate has probably always raged. It's raged this century, most certainly, in China, Russia, places, secret believers, and all that kind of thing. I'm not going to stand in criticism of those people. I have never faced that. Okay? The worst thing that has ever happened to me because of my stand for the Lord is people have insulted me. Who am I to stand and belittle those believers who've had to face those circumstances and took that way out? However, I don't find that in the Scriptures. Can you imagine Paul doing that? I mean, can you imagine Paul? Can you imagine Peter doing that? Well, I mean, when Peter was right with the Lord, can you imagine him doing that? Peter did do that, but it was not a time at which we was very well praised. So my thought is, I'm with Mrs. Mance. You get a hold of this, and you realize that the worst thing they can do to you or your family, if you're believers, is send you on to heaven now. And so that's the position I would take, but I'm not going to stand here and criticize the folks all over China today who hide their gatherings from the communist authorities and hide their church membership, and who, if they were asked, would say, no, not me. I've never faced that, and so I'm not going to stand and criticize them. That's a good question. I mean, this became the question. One of the things, and we're not going to get into it so much here, we're going to get into it in the class I teach on the Reformation next semester. One of the accusations that's made against the Anabaptists was that they held meetings in a corner. In other words, they tried to get where nobody could see them to hold meetings. Well, anybody that's followed what's happened in communist countries in recent years know many times you look for a place where nobody could find you. That just makes sense. But one of the then further accusations was that some of them, even when you put them on the stand, would say, oh no, I'm never in a meeting like that, when everybody knew good and well that they were. But that again, we haven't been there, folks. We haven't been there. Can you imagine? Most of you are young enough yet that you can't. But can you imagine them not just coming for you, coming for your children? Okay, that's a whole different set of challenges. However, then let me go on and say this, because I have been asked this and had to come to grips with it, having, because of radio and so forth, somewhat of a degree of visibility opposing what's going on today. I have been asked that question, if the day comes that they do start coming for us in the United States. That's not going to happen tomorrow, but I will tell you, if you listen at the venom with which the enemies of the cross talk about us, I can imagine the day, given the chance, they would come for us. And I've decided in my own mind, so I'm not offering criticism, because I know folks who've got places to hide already set up, in less inhabited areas. And frankly, I think they're dreaming. This is not the Middle Ages. When the Waldenses hid in the mountains, people weren't looking for them with helicopters and long-distance surveillance and AWACS and all the rest of that. I think you're dreaming. But I just made up my mind for myself, if that day ever comes, I'm not going. I'm not criticizing the folks that do. If that day ever comes, I'm just going to stay wherever I was at. And if the day comes when they're going to come after us all, somebody's got to go in the beginning. So I've just made up my mind that I am not going to do that, and I am not going to move, and I am not going to run. But if the day comes and believers flee to the mountains again, I'm not going to offer them, the folks that do that, any criticism. Okay, I don't want to get too far afield on this because we want to get back to this. Let's go back. B, it's Michael Sattler. Michael Sattler. He's a Roman Catholic priest that gets saved. And he starts preaching all the Baptist distinctives. Michael Sattler, he's a Roman Catholic priest that gets saved, and he starts preaching all the Baptist distinctives. And he begins to travel throughout Switzerland preaching. And apparently the Lord gave him a great deal of influence. But he gets arrested, and they burn him at the stake and drown his wife. During 1 year, the same year in which Sattler dies, during that 1 year, the Protestants now, not the Catholics, the Protestants drowned 25,000 people in Switzerland. There are occasions of them coming and taking a whole church and chaining every man, woman, and child together and throwing them in the river. So they drown together. 25,000 folks in 1 year. Protestants did that. That's why when folks call us Baptist Protestants, I would like to slight a small difference with that. That just came up. I was interviewed on a talk show Friday in Ontario, London, Ontario, and apparently the fellow likes to harass Christians to some degree on the talk show, and that just came up about this whole idea of the state church, and I made a point. We Baptists have never been fond of state churches. State churches have always put us to death, no matter whose state church it was. So that if you want to blame the tragedy of state churches on somebody, don't be blaming it on us. C, Anabaptists came to be a majority in the Swiss town of Bern. They came to be a majority in the Swiss town of Bern. And there they united with the Waldenses in the area. They became a majority in the town of Bern, and then they united with the Waldenses in the area. Under persecution, most of these Baptists moved to Holland. Under persecution, most of these Baptists moved to Holland. And some of these Swiss Anabaptists living in Holland became the first colonists in the Dutch colonies in the New World. You remember New York, New Jersey, and gosh, somebody help me here. There's another. Delaware. New York, New Jersey, and Delaware were originally Dutch colonies. And many of the first people that came to the Dutch colony were actually Swiss Baptists. And we talk about the first Baptist church in the colonies being in Rhode Island, and that is true in the sense of a formal open church with the building and all that. But the Baptists in Rhode Island weren't the first Baptists. The first Baptists weren't even in the English colonies. They were in the Dutch colonies. Even today, if you go to Bern in Switzerland, you find a number of Baptist churches. By the way, there's a town in Indiana named after them. It's got a little, after Bern, and it's got a little plaque. It doesn't mention the Anabaptists as such, but it mentions the town of Bern for defying the state church in Switzerland and welcoming people that were not part of the state church. Roman numeral 4. This ought to be obvious, but the Swiss Anabaptists were very clear in denying that they were either Roman Catholic or Protestant. They were very clear in denying that they were either Roman Catholic or Protestant. Now, it was easy for them to remember this. Most of them were former Catholics who were being persecuted by the Protestants. So they did not have much trouble remembering this. And while there's a lot of worthy things to be said about the Protestant Reformation, for example, it's the Protestant Reformation that puts the Bible in the language of the people in country after country after country. This is the place where the Protestant Reformation falls so short of what God would have had with the idea of a state church. And now, I want you to watch this because this is important. Zwingli, and same thing we're going to see, I think, Thursday. Not Thursday, then early next week. Zwingli preaches salvation by faith, makes a profession of faith, preaches to people who get saved, but because he does not understand the separation of church and state, someone whose testimony is that they were a believer ends up becoming the persecutor of other believers. The same thing happens with Martin Luther. To a lesser degree, the same thing happens with John Calvin. So that's led to considerable debate. Were these folks really saved? Could really saved people do this to their brothers and sisters in Christ? And, that's a hard thing. I have taught publicly at times past that these men were villains because they killed my forefathers or approved of the killing of my forefathers. I don't think Luther can directly be tied to any of it, but at times he spoke favorably of what went on in other places. But what I want to say to you again, these men lived in an entirely different world than you and I are used to. In their mind, they were protecting their whole movement that broke from Catholicism. Their thinking was warped. Their thinking was wrong because they exalted their reason above the Scriptures on this point. And anytime anybody exalts their reason above the Scriptures on any point, they're wrong. But I've honestly come to the conclusion these were probably all saved men. They preached and they preached the gospel. They risked their lives for the gospel. That they were probably saved men. But I want to make this point. Okay? When we don't submit ourselves to the Scriptures on every point, we open the door for all kinds of tragedy, no matter how sincere we are. We open the door for all kinds of tragedy in our service for Christ when we do not submit ourselves to the Scriptures on every point. It's not just enough to say, I'll submit myself to what the Bible teaches about salvation. We better be submitted to the Bible on every point. Somebody back that direction had a hand up a second ago. Okay, let's go on to Roman numeral 5. The Swiss Anabaptists were very clear in opposing the idea of a state church. Any state church. They were very clear in opposing the idea of a state church. And now I want us to move on to Roman numeral 6. This is important. I want us to make sure we get it. You often read in the history books that the Swiss Anabaptists were communists. And when I first started to study this for the purpose of doing some teaching on Baptist history, this was something that concerned me. Okay? I'm no fan of communism by any stretch of the imagination. And I kept reading in these books that just lightly cover this, that the Swiss Anabaptists, probably the most famous of our forefathers, were communists. This bothered me. Baptist distinctives and communism. How do we wrap that up in one package? So I got to studying this more closely, particularly reading some of the, because we have the writings and so forth of some of these men available today. So I got to reading what they wrote about things, and I couldn't find this anywhere. I could not find this anywhere in their writings about owning everything in common. The church history books say they own their land in common. They own their cattle in common. Some of them even said they had their wives in common. This is all pretty serious stuff. So I got to try to figure this out. And so then I got to reading their enemies, what their enemies wrote about them. This is the background of their being accused of communism, which believes everybody owns everything in common. This is the background. Here's a man and his wife. They're living on a farm. The authorities identify them as Anabaptists. They come after them. They take their house. They take their cattle. They take their land. Pretty quickly, you find them living in another house. Everybody's come together and built for them. On other land that's been given to them. And they've got cattle again that's been given to them. Their enemies assumed that for that to happen, they must own all things in common. But that's the assumption of their enemies. You tell me what happened, knowing that. They took care of one another, just exactly the way the Bible taught. If somebody got sick, this man's wife might come over and care for the family during the sickness. That's not sharing wives in common. That's brothers and sisters taking care of each other. But their enemies couldn't understand that. They couldn't understand how this person would give up one of his cows and that one and that one and that one to take care of the brethren. So the charge of communism comes because their enemies could not understand what they were doing. That doesn't tell you anything about the Swiss Anabaptists being bad. That tells you something about their enemies. Okay? Now, one thing that comes up over and over again among the Swiss Anabaptists, and I want you to turn there if you got your Bibles handy. Look at John chapter 13 and verse 34. They listed this as one of their distinctives of their faith. I think this was pretty good job on their part, by the way. I think we'd do better if we made this the Seventh Baptist distinctive. John chapter 13, verse 34 and 35. A new commandment I give unto you, that ye love one another as I have loved you, that ye also love one another. By this shall all men know that ye are my disciples, if you have love one to another. And they taught that if you wanted to have a testimony as a Christian, your life had to be characterized by loving the brethren. Okay? Their enemies thought that was communism, but their enemies didn't have a clue what was happening. Not a clue. So, Roman numeral 6. The charge that the Swiss Anabaptists were communists is absolutely false. The charge that the Swiss Anabaptists were communists. I know how many of the most famous, best-known Protestant church history books say that. Funny thing, those same church history books miss the story about all the persecutions. The charge that they were communists is absolutely false. The Anabaptists took care of one another in times of persecution in obedience to John 13, verse 34 and 35. The Anabaptists took care of one another in times of persecution in obedience to John chapter 13, verse 34 and 35. Now, I want to deal with another charge made against them. The church history books will tell you that they did not believe in marriage and that they just cohabited. Okay? That's a pretty serious charge too. But you begin to study them, that's not the case at all. When you took a vow in the state church to get married, part of the marriage vow was that you would raise up your children in the state church. So many of them refused to take the state church marriage vow, and so they did not have a license from the state church to be married. Instead, they went in front of their pastor and their church and committed themselves to one another in a morally binding contract to take upon themselves all the obligations of marriage. So they had church marriages rather than state marriages. There are some folks practicing that today. I don't think that's a wise idea personally. I do think one of the few legitimate roles of the state is record keeping, and I think one of the legitimate roles of the state is dealing with the issue of marriage. But I want you to watch this. When the state ruined the marriage vows and the marriage contract, and these folks then went to their church to authorize the marriage vows and the marriage contract, they weren't the ones that were messing anything up. It was the state that was messing it up. And I promise you that in God's eyes, those folks were married. And in their eyes, they were married. That is not the same thing at all when people describe them as saying instead of getting married, they just live together. That is not the same thing at all. There's no comparison between what's going on so commonly today and what the Swiss Anabaptists did. That's absolutely false history. A couple of things, I'm going to take time to break them down in Roman numerals. A couple of things that I want to make sure that you get down. The Swiss Anabaptists also refused to serve in the military. Some people have said they were pacifists because of that. Maybe a few of them were. But can you think of a reason why they would refuse to serve in the military? Well, not necessarily that. That didn't keep a Christian from serving in the military. Andy?
They didn't believe in what they were fighting for.
Didn't believe in what they were fighting for. Take it a step farther. Who were the military being used against? Them. Okay? And I've seen people say, well, they wouldn't serve in the military. Would you want to serve in the military that was coming after you and your family? Okay, that's a whole different ball game than folks today saying they won't serve in the military. Okay? They wouldn't take loyalty oaths to the government. Well, how loyal would you be to a government that was trying to kill you? That is not at all the same thing as someone being disloyal to a legitimate government. Make a long story short, even though they're persecuted for a period of time, they really win the battle. Because within a century, the Swiss have got religious freedom. The ideas of the Baptists are eventually adopted by the Swiss people in general. And even though they keep a state church, they get some favors from the government. Today, you could go to Switzerland and, go as a foreigner to Switzerland. They're not as favorable to missionaries. But a Swiss people can start a Baptist church without harassment today in Switzerland. The Baptist idea of religious liberty eventually wins in Switzerland. That's what I'm trying to say. So even though they go through all this, and they go through this terrible time of persecution and so forth, and they eventually win the day. Furthermore, they not only start churches, Swiss Anabaptists not only start churches all over Switzerland and all over Holland and all over Germany, many of the first Baptist churches in Russia were started by Swiss Anabaptists. We'll talk more about that later. And then I think you got to add to that too, their answer, not Anabaptist but Baptist, finally settles once and for all what we're going to be called. So the enemies gave them the name of Anabaptist, but it's their answer to that that created the name that the people who believe what we believe have been called ever since. And I think it's the name that'll stick with us. That we're Baptists. And so we have these forefathers to honor. Let me say one more thing I want you to be aware of it. I got a minute here. Well, I got to move quick. Let me say one more thing. The Anabaptists also practiced church discipline. They would not let you remain in the church if you lived a wicked life. And that was something that people around them couldn't understand. But they got a reputation for purity because they practiced church discipline. It would not hurt some independent Baptist churches today to think that through. Y'all dismissed.